Hello, my lovelies. Welcome to Lady McCreepster's Night Noise Horror Podcast. This evening's tale comes from a dear listener, John L. Taylor, and is called What Gasoline Won't Burn. Let's get straight to it, shall we, my dears? Come now, lean in closer, and we'll begin. Indiana, 1951. Grandfather never let me in the basement alone. That was his rule. "Not without me, Betsy," he'd always say. "I promised your mother I'd keep you safe, and I'm going to." It wasn't dirty down there, or filled with tools. It was whatever he kept locked in the room at the far end. Nobody got to go in there. Even he wouldn't go in, but a few times a year. But he always kept it guarded, especially on Halloween or Midsummer's Eve. He'd never tell us why or what he kept there, but every Halloween he'd sit there all night with his old shotgun leveled at the door till sunrise. That door, the strong wooden one he built himself that was covered in strange carved symbols. It always bothered me when I saw it. Something about those stars that pointed the wrong way and squiggly writing on it. It seemed like it didn't belong with us in Indiana, like something church-going folks wouldn't keep around the house. It smelled bad too. The smell of garlic, tannin, and foul herbs choked the dry air, like he was curing leather. Grandfather gathered those funny herbs and flowers at night and brought them down to the basement to his locked room. Always on the same nights in March and September. Grandfather called those nights equinoxes, said it has an effect on the potency of the charms of the plants. Grandfather never told me what they were for or why they needed to be harvested at night. Grandma didn't know why either. She'd just sigh and change the subject whenever it got mentioned, which wasn't often. Grandfather was so wise. He was a pillar of the community. Everyone in our town said so. He was a noble at the Lodge of the Eleusinian Mysteries. They were, he said, a club like the Moose or Elks Lodge. But I knew better because the lodge's inside doors had the same kind of markings as the one in the basement. Grandfather had told the men at the lodge what was behind the door. They all said he was a special kind of man to shoulder such a burden, but they never told me what that meant. Grandfather was strange, though. He didn't like it when things were odd or out of the ordinary. He always told me to tell him if I saw anything funny or unnatural going on. He didn't like things or trinkets from other countries either, and he never let anyone bring a bell into the house. It makes him so very mad if someone tries. I wanted to play handbells for a school concert one year, but Grandfather yelled when he found them and smashed them with his hammer. I cried and said it was unfair, but Grandfather said that only a church bell can be trusted, and that was that. That may make him sound mean, but he wasn't. Grandfather was good to me. He used to tell me bits of wisdom my daddy learned during the war in Europe 7 years ago. Grandfather had a haunted look in his eyes when he talked about it. I never knew why. Over and over, he'd tell me that the Germans burned what they should have loved and loved what should burn forever. He usually needed a drink of whiskey after that lecture, but he gave it often. It seemed so important to him. "I promised your parents, Betsy, and I mean swore my Bible, that I'd keep you safe from what they found under Berlin, and by thunder I'm going to keep that oath till I die and then some." I asked him once what that all meant, but a quick glance from Grandma got him to answer, "Well, that's all talk. You'll understand someday," and then go silent with the quiet resignation of a man being sent to the electric chair. One windy night in late June, I had to come to the basement to fetch Grandma a jar of canned beets. I saw Grandfather sitting there on an old folding chair and sipping a bottle of whiskey, his double-barreled shotgun trained on the locked door. The old farmhouse groaned and creaked in the hot wind, like always, but tonight was different. The sounds were scary. A groaning not like timbers, but like someone choking, echoed softly in the dark basement. "Grandfather, what's that noise?" I asked, my voice trembling a bit. "What noise?" he said. "All I hear is your grandmother yelling for a jar of beets." Grandfather heard it too. I could tell, but he never even looked up from the door. "Betsy, just get the jar and run along," he said without ever looking over his shoulder. "Grandma wants you to come upstairs and help her," I told him. "I can't," he replied. "Wind's gone all witchy tonight and a bunch of cats missing. I need to keep an eye on things down here." "But what things?" I asked impatiently. "What do you keep there that means so much to you?" "There's things you wouldn't understand yet," Grandfather said, raising his voice a bit. "Things no one should understand. No good Christian should ever see what's beyond that door, Betsy." "Then why do you like them so much, Grandfather?" "I don't like them at all. They don't even belong to me." "You taught me it's not nice to keep things that aren't yours, Grandfather," I said. "What's in that room belongs to the devil," Grandfather snapped at me. "And if I could give it all back to him, I would. All I can tell you, Betsy, is never trust what gasoline won't burn. Now get back to the kitchen before I take my belt to you." I ran back upstairs, crying a little. Over the groaning, I could hear Grandfather curse under his breath. "Damn witchy wind," he muttered, sipping his whiskey and never looking away from the door. One day in late August, when I was walking down the road home, I saw a funny thing. An old woman with thick sunglasses. She was walking through the town graveyard, wearing a scarf in August and clanging a pair of bells together. They were pretty silver bells held together on a chain. They were oddly shaped and had writing on them, like on Grandpa's basement door. They sounded so pretty, yet cut me to the soul. I don't know why, but I walked into the graveyard to hear the bells. The old lady walked from headstone to headstone, clanging the bells and waiting a moment to listen, like she was waiting for a reply. "What you doing with the pretty bells?" I asked her. "Looking for some old friends," she said. "We always play these bells just before Laikaya." "What's Laikaya?" I asked, trying to pronounce the word. "It's an old holiday. They don't celebrate much since the churches were built, child," the old lady replied. "But when I was your age, it was very important." I recognized the lady now. Old Mrs. Enyo. She was blind and had lived there for years. The old ladies never liked her because she never went to church with them, always saying she was Greek and her type of church wasn't found around here. She had no friends here, never did. She always wore that old scarf, rain or shine. Said it was to cover a burn scar from an accident years ago. "You have friends buried here?" I asked her. "I thought so, but I can't find them under any of these stones, child." "But how are you reading them?" I asked. "The grown-ups say your eyes don't work." Mrs. Enyo smiled, a wide, satisfied smile, one that I didn't think I'd see from such a remark. "They don't know much about my eyes," she said. "Why, through these thick glasses, how can you be sure I have eyes at all?" "But you must have eyes to see the writing with," I said. "There are many ways to see, child," she continued. "Growing up in Arcadia taught me to see in many ways these so-called grown-ups around here haven't learnt yet, and to read in ways they can't. Like the writing on your bells? I asked again. Grandfather can read that too. It's like the writing on his cellar door. When Mrs. Enyo heard this, she knelt and rested her hand on my shoulder. Your grandfather has a door with writing like this, child? She asked. Where, pray tell, does he live? With Grandma, on the farmhouse on Sutton's Road, I answered. Why do you ask? Mrs. Enyo stood up and smiled. Now, run along home with your groceries and don't tell Grandfather about me just yet. I'll visit soon, and I may need to borrow something from your grandmother. I recognized the tone of voice she had. Grown-ups got to it when they thought children were too young to understand what we were asking them. Grandmother would always get that tone when she said, This is all talk, Betty. I knew the conversation was over. Mrs. Enyo walked away, laughing in the wind, like she just won a prize at the fair. Somehow I felt I had made a mistake talking to her, but I had to get the groceries home before the milk curdled in the heat. 2 weeks later, Grandfather had to leave town for a few days. The lodge's annual convention was happening in Salem, Massachusetts, and he needed to catch a train there. He said his goodbyes and gave his keys to Grandmother, along with his usual stern warning to keep out of the basement. I can't afford to lose this key, Grace, he told Grandma as he wrapped her hand around it. I'll be back in a few days. For heaven's sake, keep your eyes open and shut that door. One afternoon, almost a week later, I came home to find Grandma getting ready to go to town. She was putting on her good church shawl, odd for a Tuesday, and had Mrs. Enyo's bells hanging out of her purse. Grandma, you met Mrs. Enyo? I asked her. Yes, child, Grandma said. I let her borrow some sugar and flour, and she lent me her bells while your grandfather's away. Are you sure Grandfather won't mind? What he doesn't know won't hurt him, Grandmother said with a smile. Now go play, child. I have some errands to run. I'll be back after sundown. That night, the hot, witchy wind came back, much stronger this time. There was lightning with it, but no rain fell. I woke up to the sound of the house groaning and creaking louder than ever. Every board rattled in the wind. The wind chimes on the front porch clanged, but something was different about them. Another sharp clanging joined them, and the wind got stronger. I thought I heard a voice downstairs. I hoped it wasn't a voice. No voice should sound like that, hissing and croaking nonsense words that seemed too at home in the dark. Grandma? I called when I heard the floors creak below. Only the wind answered. No, not the wind. Screams. Muffled screams. I pulled the covers over my head. Despite the heat, a chill ran through me. The groaning got louder and louder, and I shut my eyes tighter and tighter. It was like the whole house was moaning in pain. Now I lay me down to sleep. I whispered my prayers over and over, but the noise got even louder. When I said, if I die before I wake, I could hear the choking sound again. Dry and crackling like a mouthful of dead leaves, like it knew I was scared and was happy about it. Suddenly, the wind gusted a battering and the choking moan echoed one last time, and the whole house shook. I heard the basement stairs creaking violently, followed by such a horrible sound. It reminded me of pictures from Grandma's old, thick Bible. Pictures of hell. I screamed into my pillow. Suddenly, everything got very quiet. My muffled crying was all I heard, besides the screen doors slamming in the breeze and the faint, distant clang of silver bells. I didn't sleep that night. I just huddled under the covers, listening to the screen door slam until the sun was bright in the morning sky. I was more afraid for Grandma now than for anything that might be lurking. I had to go downstairs and face the truth. "Grandma?" I called out over and over to an empty house. No answer. I became more frightened with each step. "Grandma!" I screamed, rushing from room to lifeless room. The only answer was the buzzing of hundreds of flies outside. It was joined by the sound of the tool shed's door slamming in the breeze. We never left that door ajar. Grandfather would yell at me if I did. Slowly, I crept to the front door and around the yard, the flies growing ever thicker and a stench like a butcher's shop, making me sick in the summer heat. I reached the door to shut it, and it flapped open. I couldn't hear the hinges squeaking or the flies buzzing. My screams were too loud. There was a mess of bloody flesh lying in the dirt. It was covered in flies that bit at it greedily. It looked mangled and skinned, like a rabbit about to be cooked. But this was no rabbit. It was a human being. The raw skull glistened red and grinned at me beneath lidless eyes that stared in pain. My grandmother's eyes. I stopped screaming and wept. I ran half blind from tears for the kitchen door, hoping somehow this was all a nightmare, that the slamming screen door would somehow wake me up. It didn't, because the kitchen was having the nightmare too. Inside, I saw a black, tarry mess smearing the floor, leading from the screen door to the basement steps. I was afraid to step in it. Even the flies in the kitchen wouldn't touch it. The basement door was open and Grandfather's special key was laying on the floor in a puddle of the tarry mess. I had to find Grandma. I had to look. I took the keys and went downstairs. The floor was coated with more of the black slop. The smell was worse than ever, but the strange door was unlocked. I held my breath and I closed my eyes, then opened it. I stepped in and opened them. Why did I have to open my eyes? Hanging from the ceiling by old grimy ropes were the mummies of the three most horrible things I'd ever seen. Dead, charred, leathery things that looked like men but weren't. Each had a wreath of henbane and belladonna and a rosary around their shriveled necks. Talons, not fingers, clawed at them in vain. Cracked flesh wrapped ribs that held no breath and were caked with old tar. But the faces, dear heaven, the faces. Those misshapen skulls that looked like wolves and goats. Their dried flesh, like a withered pumpkin, warped the jaws into a wicked, sickly grin. They seemed to mock my fear, but that wasn't the worst of them. It was those sunken, hollow eye sockets oozing with tar. I could feel hell staring back at me. I couldn't turn away. I couldn't even scream. I could only back away towards the light at the stairway until I backed into something cold and hard, the barrels of Grandfather's shotgun. "Damn it, Betsy!" he roared and grabbed me by the hair. He was covered in blood. I screamed and fought him as he checked the back of my neck for a moment. He breathed a sigh of relief and then let go and stepped in front of me, shotgun drawn on the mummies that hung there. His eyes darted nervously from abomination to abomination. "I'm so sorry," I blubbered through a flood of tears. "Please, Grandfather, don't." "I ain't gonna hurt you, Betsy," he replied without turning to me. "You're not what worries me right now. What worries me is the last time I counted, I had 10 of these devil things hanging in here and your grandmother still had flesh on her bones." "You saw Grandma too?" "Skinned alive in the tool shed," he replied. "Must have been there a day and a half," he replied and hugged me with tears in his eyes. "No," I blurted out. "That can't be. She borrowed Mrs. Enyo's bells yesterday," I protested. Grandfather's eyes went wide and his sorrow turned to pure hate at the sound of her name. He gripped my shoulders tightly. "Who let that accursed witch on this property?" Grandfather roared. "Didn't I warn you, Betsy? Didn't I tell you never to trust what gasoline won't burn?" somewhat of a delicious classic witch tale. If you enjoyed this story, do let me know on Facebook or Twitter. My handle is Lady McCreepster on both. If you're watching on YouTube, leave me a comment below. To you, my dear newcomer, welcome to my realm. Feel free to have a peek around and be sure to subscribe before you leave. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that bell icon too. That's all I have for you this evening, my dears. Till next time, sweet dreams.